Hello, everyone. Welcome. Thanks for being here. If you are online with us on Zoom, if you could just mute yourself if you haven't already done so. My name is Jackie Fernandez Hamburg. I'm the curator at the Sheldon Jackson Museum, and thank you for being here for our last presentation in our Share Your Culture, Share Your Research series. We're really pleased to have Ursula here with us. And I'll just get started with a land acknowledgement, a few announcements, and then bio information, and then turn it over to Ursula. So thank you everybody for being here. Thanks especially to the Friends of Sheldon Jackson Museum for funding all the costs for this series that we've been hosting for a couple of years now. If anyone's interested in sharing their research or their culture, please reach out and let me know how you'd like to get involved. We have this series every single year. Thanks also to private donors who support the Friends of Sheldon Jackson Museum. So to begin, we'd like to acknowledge and express our appreciation to the Indigenous people of Tlingit-Ani, which is where I'm zooming in from. They've occupied this land for longer than any of us can imagine, and after 250 years of colonization are graciously allowing us to share this amazing land with them. Thank you so much. We do have a few events coming up, including Saturday, May 3rd presentation with Mike Livingston. He's the annual meeting guest speaker. The annual meeting for the Friends of Sheldon Jackson Museum will take place at the museum this Saturday at 1 o'clock. I hope you can make it. For those of you who are zooming in from afar, the presentation that he's giving will be on Benny Benson, the designer of the Alaska State flag. And his presentation will start at 2 o'clock Alaska time, and there is Zoom option if you'd like to attend. You can get information on the Friends of Sheldon Jackson Museum website, and you can also call the museum for information to be sent to you by email. So we're very pleased here to have with us today Ursala Hudson. She's an interdisciplinary artist of German, English, Filipino, and Tlingit descent. She is Raven Moiety of the Daktainton clan from the Head House. Through her primary mediums of Chilkat and Raven's Tail weaving, she engages fields of Indigenous feminisms and Native spirituality to address the colonial project, institutional reform, and cultural remediation. She's the daughter of the late Clarissa Rizal and sister to Lily Hope, both notable textile weavers and culture bearers. We've hosted Lily Hope here a number of times. Ursula's woven garments have walked runways internationally and been collected by museums such as the Burke Museum, the National Museum of the American Indian, the Smithsonian American Art Museum, and Ursula has received art fellowships from Indian Collective, Native Arts and Culture, First Peoples Fund, and the Institute of American Indian Arts. She was born and raised in Southwest, living and working in her childhood home with her two daughters. Ursula, we're so pleased to have you here today and to work with you. Thank you so much. Please join us for her presentation.
All right. Hello, Karusne dechat duasak dakdintana hat kashayi hit yidach. It is good to see you all today. It's awesome to see some friends in the audience. And thank you to, this is not moving. Thank you to Shelton Jackson and Jackie for hosting this lecture. I haven't gotten to share my research. I'm not going to be sharing too much of my art with this presentation. But I am a transdisciplinary artist, meaning that my different fields of study and mediums influence each other. So I am a weaver of Northwest Coast regalia, but I'm also a scholar and a painter and a printmaker. And I am the daughter of the late Clarissa Rizal Lampy Hudson, who was an apprentice to Jenny Clenot. And as Jackie said, Lily Hope is my sister, the president of the newly founded Northwest Coast Textile Center initiative. And we are Daktainton, Raven from the Head House. So our ancestral homelands are in Glacier Bay, Alaska, but I was born and raised and currently reside in the Southwest, about 3 hours north of Santa Fe. And I was raised in close proximity to my full-time parents. I was homeschooled, so I've been making art my whole life. And my parents, Bill and Clarissa, were engaged in the Tlingit culture renaissance of the 70s and 80s, even though my dad is white. So by the time I came along in the 80s, I was fully immersed in a culture-centered art practice. So growing up in that world, homeschooled and surrounded by artists, I developed certain beliefs about what art meant to the world, to people, without much exposure to more mainstream ideas about art. So it wasn't until I started weaving and participating in the Indigenous and global art worlds that I began to realize how the broader world generally views art's cultural purpose. But before I get into that, I should explain that although I was raised around my mom and dad, I didn't start weaving or participating in Indigenous arts willingly on a daily basis until my mom passed in 2016. Because it takes over 1,000 hours to weave a ceremonial robe. So it requires a lot of patience, but also a lot of material preparation. And so I saw weaving as a miserable chore growing up. But when my mom passed and without having her around and my sister, my aunties far away in Alaska, weaving afforded me a deep connection to things and people that I didn't quite understand, but I knew that I needed it. And so I started to work on this collection of woven pieces influenced by modern silhouettes, my mixed heritage, my natural environment, and I started designing a line of classic Black garments to accompany the woven garments and creating full ensembles that quickly carried me into this international Indigenous art world. And I received a few key opportunities that brought this work into both Indigenous and non-Indigenous spaces, elevating it to a level that I had never really had time to consider or imagine for this work. But it felt right. It was exciting. I felt honored. I felt honored to represent the Tlingit culture, to represent female art. I felt I feel that this work is absolutely not mine alone, but an extension of my parents, my mom, and so it is my mom's work. And so I feel honored and blessed to get to share her work with the world. And I wanted to see what else my mom and my dad and those that inspire me, my ancestors, everyone that's come before, I wanted to see how they could all continue to be expressed further through my hands. So I applied for the Masters of Fine Arts program at the Institute of American Indian Arts in Santa Fe to be shaped in a new way. And that program, with its mentor-mentee framework, its emphasis and encouragement of experimentation, the thesis development requirement, all of that helped me articulate that female gendered art practices like weaving, sewing, basketry, beadwork aren't just beautiful expressions or cultural artifacts. They are acts of resilience, of memory, of community tending. Yet these practices have been systematically devalued, not only by our colonial and capitalist structures, but often within our own communities as well. So today I want to share with you how my research and my creative work seek to elevate these practices, not only for the survival of our traditions, but for the collective prosperity of future generations. And this work is personal for me, but it's also political. It comes from years of being wrapped up in Chilkat and Ravenstail weaving, from raising two daughters as a mother of mixed ancestry, from working alongside Indigenous knowledge holders and cultural institutions, and from digging into Indigenous feminism theory and decolonial ideas. And it's also been shaped by my own lived experience, showing up every day to recenter the importance of female gendered art practices. So, two big ideas have guided me through all this. And they are, firstly, art isn't just about beauty or decoration. It's a tool. Art is a tool for healing, for resisting injustice, and for keeping our communities strong and connected. And second, systems like capitalism, colonialism, and the heteropatriarchy, I'll explain all these in a second. These systems have worked together to devalue the kinds of art practices I'm talking about. And the loss hasn't just hurt Indigenous communities, it's affected all of us because it's broken some of the oldest teachings we have about how to live well with each other and with the land. But these practices are still here. And these practices offer powerful ways to imagine and build better futures. So before I go any further, I'd like to take a second to unpack a few of these big words. So when I say colonialism, I'm talking about when people take land, take resources, and take things away from others. Something that happened here and is still shaping our lives today. Capitalism is an economic system where making money is valued above everything else, often at the cost of people, the cost of communities, and the earth. And heteropatriarchy basically means a system where straight men hold the most power, and anything outside of that, like women's leadership, gender diversity, or community-centered ways of life, anything outside of that tends to get pushed aside or undervalued. And when I say female gendered art practices, I'm not just talking about cisgendered women, meaning those who were assigned female at birth and still identify that way. These practices, weaving, sewing, basketry, beadwork, were traditionally seen as women's work, but they have been carried forward by people of all genders. And what matters most isn't who's making the art, it's the role that this art plays. Tending to the home, tending to the land, to the next generations. It's work that keeps our communities intertwined. And I also recognize that gender coding, meaning the way that societies label certain activities, roles, traits as like masculine or feminine, male or female, gender coding has shifted across time, across cultures, and even within individuals. And gender wasn't always fixed or binary the way that Western systems try to make it. So understanding that gives us a bigger picture. These practices weren't sidelined because they were lesser. They were sidelined because they carry transformative community sustaining power, power that threatened colonial and patriarchal systems and continues to threaten those systems. So when I first started researching all this, it was personal. I was responding to some disorienting experiences I'd had as a female craftsperson, but those experiences woke me up, and I realized that some of the institutions and individuals I was working with, both Indigenous and Western, were operating from capitalist motives. And these motives reframed my work to fit into extractive systems. Systems that diminished its real power and purpose. And I realized I was a resource to be extracted. And even Indigenous organizations meant to protect and elevate our cultures, sometimes end up replicating colonial structures of power, sometimes pushing aside the very people and practices that they set out to support. And I found myself being invited into cultural institutions, but misrecognized once I was there. I was seen as a symbol of tradition, but stripped of agency or misunderstood when it came to the deeper intentions behind my work. And the more I engaged, the clearer it became that these institutions were trying to preserve culture, but often doing so without questioning the structures that continue to suppress culture. One example is I was commissioned to create this Chilkat backdrop for the Rock Indigenous Music Festival because the director of the festival had heard about the customary practice of clan leaders commissioning a Chilkat robe and cutting it up during a potlatch and giving the pieces out to notable community members. This practice is super on brand for Tlingit protocol. It demonstrates gratitude and reinforces systems of reciprocity. And protocols like this are necessary to foster a strong sense of interconnection between our clans. So the festival director wanted to cut up the backdrop and give pieces of it out to the performers and the organizers to reawaken this practice in a contemporary setting. But on the night of the event, I was informed that the sponsors, heritage centers, native corporations in which I'm tribally enrolled, reframed the backdrop project as a monetary investment. They wanted to use the backdrop again because it costs a lot of money to commission it. So they delayed the payoff ceremony. And these sponsors, these cultural entities are charged with protecting Tlingit and Haida resources. So they claimed that it was more responsible not to destroy the piece prematurely. And from my perspective, their decision to prioritize its material value over its intended ceremonial purpose kind of revealed how capitalist motives have seeped into our leadership, disrupted the very practices that once sustained clan relationships and spiritual well-being. So this experience, among others, prompted me to ask harder questions about systems I'd once assumed were safe. I started to look critically at the treatment of customarily female gendered art forms, or what is often dismissed as craft. And through this work, it became clearer just how systemic the devaluation of these practices really is. It's not just a reflection of broader oppression. This systemic devaluation is part of how oppression continues. Devaluing female gendered art keeps entire communities marginalized across genders and around the world. And before I became a professional weaver, I lived in a very different world, a world where creativity, ceremony, performance, expression, they were just a part of everyday life. I was homeschooled in that environment too, so I was surrounded by artists, activists, social deviants, and growing up, I honestly thought the world treated art and artists as central, vital, powerful. I understood that art is life and life is art. And the way that we move our hands and what becomes of that movement are extensions of our relationships to the natural world, to the spiritual world and each other. Our movements express and are shaped by our relationships to time. Our movements express our relationships to space and to community. And how we care for each other is informed by our art. And our art is informed by how we care for each other. So what we make, whether that's pictorial or sonic or kinetic, it's shaped by how we move through the world and how the world moves us. Our creations are extensions of values, of aesthetics, reaching backward and forward through time, always participating in society, always in relation with their creators and communities. And so in this context, aesthetics are not just surface level decoration. They are systems of knowledge. Aesthetics are systems of knowledge. They transfer memory and they train perception. Objects, belongings are born of the land and they're inscribed with information. The material practice, the doing, the tangible practice trains practitioners to continually confront challenges, reimagine solutions, navigate these constantly evolving relationships. So working with our hands, whether with contemporary or traditional materials, programs our brains and our hearts. Creating objects helps the maker orient themselves within community, within time, within place. It informs our sense of self, while also fostering belonging, trust in oneself, trust in the continuum, trust in our connection to ancestors, descendants, and mm, trust trust in our connection to all the more than human relationships that hold us. And when art is understood like this, where visual language is part of a constant cycle of feeding and exchange, it reminds us of our inseparability from nature. It programs us to remember that we are nature. And when we engage in art making with that understanding, it becomes an act of stewardship, one that honors interconnection and sustains balance. And in many societies, there is little separation between the secular and the spiritual. So handwork isn't just decorative, it's a conduit for spiritual power, ancestral relationship, cultural memory. It's understood as vital, but what's often overlooked is how that labor is treated differently, depending on who is doing it and what kind of work it is. So weaving, beadwork, sewing, decorative adornment, these have been and still are today predominantly women's work. And then, you've got the carving and the painting, the sculptures. They're most often done by men. And both roles are essential to cultural survival. Yet, under colonial influence, labor that's coded as male has been increasingly professionalized, and so it's been compensated. While the labor that's coded as female has been expected to remain unpaid. It's an honor rather than a livelihood. And whether in Indigenous or Western spaces, men are commissioned to carve poles, canoes, monuments. And weavers, on the other hand, are expected to volunteer hundreds of hours, knowing the undeniable cultural value of their work, but justifying the donation of their leisure time in service of community. The joy of weaving, the healing found in community work, that joy is real. But how do we honor cultural caretakers while denying them material support? And what does it mean when honoring becomes another form of extraction? Weavers are positioned as cultural caretakers, expected to give, but not receive. Their contributions are seen as priceless, yet also somehow not worth paying for. And calling it an honor turns the expectation of unpaid labor into something sacred, making it harder to question or challenge the injustice that's underneath. And this imbalance exposes a deeper reality, which is that when work coded as female is treated as love, and male-coded work is treated as labor, cultural continuity becomes a gendered burden. And then participating in these nourishing practices often requires a notable level of privilege, not because the work itself demands privilege, but because capitalist systems have made economic security, time, and access into prerequisites for cultural participation. And this isn't just enforced by outside systems, it's internalized. We learn to believe that tending to culture is something we must give freely without expecting compensation, protection, or even regard for our own well-being. So I've spent some time thinking about this and taking inventories of the systems that have distorted our sense of worth and disrupted the value placed on female contributions, and to understand that we have to start with the three big forces: colonialism, capitalism, and heteropatriarchy. And colonialism didn't just steal land and resources. Colonialism disrupted Indigenous sovereignty at every level. In order to control land, colonial powers had to suppress Indigenous systems of governance, Indigenous kinship systems, gender, sexuality, and they imposed the gender binary and the nuclear family model, which reshaped Indigenous societies and undermined women's traditional authority and contributions. And colonial ideals of civilization were pretty successfully embedded into Indigenous societies. These colonial ideas were embedded into our minds, strategically obscuring our sense of cultural and individual sovereignty. They reconfigured our sense of what constitutes value, what constitutes progress, and who belongs. And then heteronormative patriarchies erased non-Western gender identities, reshaping our societies to mirror Western hierarchies. Our traditional knowledge systems were overwritten, replaced by Western ways of knowing, all to uphold this colonial project. So my research points to three major institutions that continue shaping how our society views gendered art practices today. And those are public education, museums, and the art market. So first, public education. So beyond the boarding school era, our present day elementary and secondary school systems teach marginalized populations to self-assimilate, to become more governable, right? And since institutionalized learning was not natural to Indigenous societies, even tribal schools now have defaulted to Western education models with unnatural indoctrination mechanisms that train our children to see their value through the lens of capitalism. They condition children to measure their worth through external evaluations, grades, awards, marketable skills, instead of basing their worth off of intrinsic strengths or community contributions. So, in other words, education systems train our children to serve the market and not the community. But real engagement with the world, real engagement with our art, each other, with the unseen forces, that teaches something else entirely. It teaches us how to listen, how to care, how to feel safe experimenting. It teaches us how to observe, how to fail, succeed, how to make a difference, and how to know our place within the greater continuum of nature. Real engagement with real world materials teaches real tools of critical thinking, problem solving, community tending. But capitalism would fail if our children were raised with this understanding. If our children were taught through natural education models, taught to use their hands to listen to the work, they would hold the tools that would position them to be in direct opposition to colonialism. Museums. So museums are often seen as places of preservation, but they've also been sites of cultural erasure, right? They have shaped how the world views Indigenous people and what counts as valuable art. By curating our cultural belongings, museums have controlled how we're represented and often how we are misrepresented. They decide who, what gets remembered and who and what gets erased. Because museums don't just collect objects, they collect stories and they rewrite them. They have displayed, they continue to display items taken under duress, stripped from communities, and placed behind glass, reframing them as symbols of conquest or exotic curiosity. And the way that these institutions sort and label objects by era, by style, by region, material, reflects a Western lens that disconnects those items from their original meaning. What was once a living item, a living belonging, a relative, made by hand and used in ceremony, becomes frozen in time. It becomes a specimen, a relic, a craft. And those labels matter because the moment something is called a craft instead of art or primitive instead of contemporary, it's pushed into the margins. It's devalued. It's it's not just economically devalued, but spiritually devalued. And with this, the people who made it are distanced from its meaning. And this especially affects female gendered art forms like weaving, beading, basketry, often dismissed as decorative or domestic. And their spiritual and intellectual power, their ties to knowledge, to place, to prayer, are erased. And museums don't just collect objects, they rewrite stories. And they also help shape markets. So throughout the 20th century, non-Indigenous authorities dictated what counted as authentic Indigenous art. They defined it through publications, through exhibitions, um, and directives, well-meaning directives that that it reached into the colonized Indigenous communities worldwide. So, for example, this is James Houston, who is super famous for his hand in the proliferation of the indigenous arts of the Arctic. So, yeah, last century, indigenous subsistence lifestyles were impacted by Western resource policies and a new economic system that made it so Indigenous people needed to find new livelihoods, right? So making art became not a knowledge system, but a means of survival. And so James Houston, through his many, many pamphlets, told Indigenous people up in Alaska, Canada area, what to make and how to make it look. So the aesthetics were no longer systems of knowledge making, keeping, sharing. They were a means of survival, dictated to appear primitive or unsoiled by the Western market, but dictated by the Western market. And then, oddly enough, innovation, change, or any kind of sign of Western influence was labeled as evidence of corruption or like cultural decline or assimilation. So these imposed ideas commodified Indigenous art and deepened gendered divisions in artistic labor. So today, carved, painted, sculptural works, those associated with public display and fine art, are privileged. And meanwhile, the sewn and woven beaded works are pushed into the private sphere, labeled as domestic, as craft, as leisure. So this argillite totem pole stands about a foot high, and it just auctioned off for almost 11 grand. This artistry, I feel, is comparable in time and expertise to this domestic item. which obviously takes great skill, woven with the labor-intensive material preparation of cedar root, and sold in auction for $144. This painted Chilkat tunic pattern board was auctioned for over $42,000, and this Chilkat blanket, which probably took 1,500 or maybe 2,000 hours to weave, auctioned for 15,000, less than half of the painted work. So substantial financial investment flows into the art forms classified as fine art, while wearable and utilitarian works, the works that stay closest to daily life, remain undervalued. And when monetary value is used to elevate certain practices while dismissing others, the livelihoods of the marginalized artists and the cultural practices themselves become unsustainable. And all of these systems are interconnected. They shape how we train our hands, how we value our practices, how we understand our own power. And the oppression of an entire gender has stripped whole societies of tactile training systems that foster diplomacy, compassion, critical thinking, belonging. Because women's work was devalued by capitalism and colonialism, it's lost not just its market value, but also its cultural, utilitarian, and spiritual worth. So when we devalue women's work, we devalue the tools needed to build whole, connected, resilient communities. So that's why I believe that the rematriation and recentering of female gendered art forms are necessary acts of community care and actually somehow super radical activism. And when I talk about rematriation as opposed to repatriation, I'm not talking about returning objects. Rematriation means bringing back living knowledge, protocols, the cosmologies that are intertwined within them. It's about reclaiming trust in women's hands, in feminine forms of leadership, in cyclical ways of living and knowing. Rematriation asks us to restore the relationships that colonization interrupted and to treat those relationships as sacred. So in my research, I found that museums historically functioned as sites of cultural erasure and commodification, but I also found that some institutions have started making moves toward ethical collaboration with source communities. So these small disruptions in the ongoing colonial violence. Still, we have to be honest. These institutions are rooted in imperial frameworks. They were originally built to extract, to display. They were originally built to treat people and artwork as resources. So when they try to repair damage, their gestures often stop at repatriation. So repatriation, let's not go to this slide yet. Repatriation might return the object, but it doesn't return the knowledge systems, the protocols, or the spiritual relationships that were stolen along with it. It doesn't reclaim the power that was taken. And I suspect that that's the point, because full rematriation would oppose the colonial project entirely. So now here's the Alaska Heritage Institution. You can see this beautiful example of how Tlingit and Haida art is being embraced and propagated at incredible speeds in Juneau, Alaska. And Sea Alaska Heritage Institute is guided by Indigenous ethics. It's doing real work to reclaim and revitalize this reverence for our art practices. But at the same time, its governance model and its emphasis on collecting mostly male-made art shows us that the internal work we still have to do is huge. This isn't just colonial residue. It reflects a broader, it reflects, it reflects the broader gender imbalances we still have to confront within our own communities. So in many ways, Sealaska Heritage Institute operates through a repatriation framework. It's returning symbols, but it needs to be fully restoring the systems of balance that rematriation would require. And so when I look at these proactive and maybe sometimes performative repatriation efforts, I don't see solutions, but I do see openings, starting points, places where we might begin to reimagine other sites of social programming, like public schools, like the art market itself. Because simply reforming these colonial institutions or building new ones modeled after them keeps us tethered to the same structures of power. But if we turn toward rematriation instead, we reclaim cultural agency on our own terms. We start to imagine frameworks that care holistically for our children and our belongings. We begin to build systems rooted in community-centered values and not colonial ideas. So I'm not suggesting that focus should be taken from historically male gendered art practices or that gender should be removed from our understanding of them. I'm proposing a deliberate shift in awareness toward recognizing the cultural erasure caused by the ongoing marginalization of female gendered practices, both within Indigenous communities and across global systems of value. So for now, at the minimum, I'm calling for an increased level of institutional funding for these practices. I'm advocating for the systemic restructuring of museums and educational models and markets, and for letting that practice in restructuring inform how we dream up new systems that truly accommodate the power that these practices hold, to raise their perceived worth, to meet that of male gendered practices, and to make space for all gendered forms of creation. So I'm advocating for the full inclusion of everyone and everything that exists between and outside of these binaries, within and beyond tradition and contemporary or colonial and indigenous, male, female, because our survival depends on it, but really because our thriving depends on it. And one ironic gift of all this colonial ignorance of capitalism's labeling of our art as domestic or insignificant is that resurgent power of the unseen and the unwritten tools that are embedded into these technologies of art making was overlooked, right? If the colonial and capitalist systems had recognized that these practices are tools of world building and resistance, they would have been identified as a direct threat to colonial systems. But instead, they survived unmonitored. And that endurance reflects a deeper form of resistance. That while male-dominated forms were co-opted or commodified, many female gendered practices removed were removed from the public's eye and remained active sites of cultural retrieval and continuity. Through material practice, we affirm our value to each other, to the land, to the greater whole. So art making isn't just a way to survive, it's a return to ourselves. It builds individuals who are critically minded, grounded, connected, people with a strong sense of place and purpose. And although I have centered female gendered art practices in this talk to expose the systems that have hidden our tools of power, I advocate for the flourishing of all creative practices because all of them hold the potential to liberate and repair. And this isn't just about replacing one hierarchy with another. It's not about that at all. It's about retrieving what was taken and transforming what we've inherited. Because art making is not just cultural revitalization. Art making is a site of resistance. It's a method of memory. Art making is a blueprint for building what comes next. And there we have it.
Thank you so much, Ursula. That was a wonderful, very refreshing presentation. I'd like to open it up to people here. If they have any questions, could you please share in the chat? And I'll start it off with a question, if that's okay, while we wait to see what people have to ask. I'm just curious, Ursula, in today's, well, I guess I'm wondering a couple things. Number one, has your research and your work shifted more recently, or have you changed any of your perspectives due to the present day circumstances and political climate? You've obviously been working on this for a long time, and things have become, I think, a little bit different in the last 100 days in particular. So I'm wondering about that. And then I'm also wondering if you have found any particularly supportive institutions or approaches when you've been working with entities specifically for mothers, because you are a mother of two children yourself, and a lot of obstacles to women who are artists like yourself who are mothers come through. So thanks for that. And then we'll open it up to other people. Wonderful presentation again.
Great, thank you. Yes, my art has changed a lot, especially over the past couple years. I'm not really sharing much of that publicly yet. And it's definitely been shaped by this research. I'm becoming more of a conceptual artist where I'd like to speak about big ideas through my material practice. And I am working on a big project that continues to confront the devaluation of women's work, which leads to your other question, which is, yeah, I sometimes in the past 100 days, I've felt that this work, like, what's the point? Like, because the landscape of this country is shifting so rapidly that it's like an anchor doesn't seem to make sense. But I just try to like quiet those voices and keep focusing on my work because it does still affect me. It still matters. I don't think all institutions are being affected by the cancellation of funding or um, the new orders coming from the top. Um, I do think that there are a lot of, or a few big organizations. I guess I'm not going to really name them, um, but I do feel like they're holding tight at the top, and they're going to keep offering financial and professional development support to artists, Indigenous artists, mothers who don't rely on, yeah, government funds or um, big oil or, yeah, funding from our most powerful people. Um, I don't know if I could name any specific organizations that have been especially supportive of female artists in general. Um, maybe not maybe. I haven't spent much time seeking out those kinds of organizations. I've just been so wrapped up in my own things that I'm sure they exist, and that other artists on this call would probably be able to offer names. Um, but I can't do that.
Thank you. It looks like we've got some questions or comments in the chat. Lots of positive feedback. How can female artists promote the rematriation of traditional arts? That comes from Lily.
Um, Rematriation, I would say being generous with um, being generous with the time you spend dreaming up new ways of sharing knowledge while simultaneously securing funding to the allow for community work to happen in a way that's not depleting to the organizers, the lead artists, and any of the participants. Um, I feel like a lot of our female gendered art practices need what they need is support to make sure that there's a space for them to happen, like to where women can convene, to where they can come around a table and dream up new ideas and nourish their communities. But that kind of intangible, like spiritual, mental work is not usually valued by our Indigenous or just global art funders or institutions because there isn't like a tangible outcome that's promised. Whereas if you create a project like we want to commission 5 totem poles and all of those totem pole carvers get housing and a stipend for creating it, the master carver gets paid. There's a tangible outcome that these institutions can be like, they can justify their funding for. And so women really need to fight for and learn how to, in this landscape, have to justify to these institutions that this funding is essential, even if there is no tangible outcome, even if it is just community building, just. And ideally, it wouldn't be that way. Ideally, we wouldn't need master artists, master female artists that are articulate and know how to fight for things like that. Ideally, there would be more trust coming from institutions, but at this time, we do need representatives that are able to make a solid argument.
And then one other question. Libby also notes that she has trouble pricing her artwork. Is there any movement towards standardizing the pricing of traditional artwork? She notes that would be extremely helpful.
That is something that I know that my sister Lily is trying to kind of encourage as a standardization. She says she can answer that. So maybe you want to reach out directly to her. It's tough because you want to make your traditional artwork accessible to the community. And so I think that when it comes to that, comes to the market within our own communities, hopefully we can go back to kind of like a trade system, a kind of a gift system. I think that that would be ideal, but my experience is mostly in more of the international art market, global art market, where money needs to flow more abundantly because there's a lot of money out there that needs to come back to the community.
And then there's a question, is your thesis available?
I did get notification today that it was approved to be published in the library at the Institute of American Indian Arts, and from my understanding that those documents are available virtually. But I can't confirm that at this time. So please reach out to me, and I can let you know as soon as it's up.
Well, if there are no other questions, I just want to say thank you so much for speaking. Really enjoyed your presentation. Thanks to all of you for being here, and we hope to see everyone again soon. Really appreciate your time and your thoughtful presentation.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.